Hi, everybody. I'm Leigh Haber, and I run Oprah's Book Club, as well as the books coverage for all of the Oprah platforms. And I am absolutely thrilled to be the moderator of this panel for the Brooklyn Books Festival. What an amazing, genius group of panelists we have. We're so lucky. I'll begin by introducing them. Ottessa Moshfegh is fiction writer from New England. Eileen, her first novel, was shortlisted for the National Book Critics Circle and the Man Booker Prize and won the Penn Hemingway Award for debut fiction. My Year of Rest and Relaxation, which if you haven't read it, you must, as you must read all of these writers' books. And Death in Her Hands, her second and third novels, were New York Times bestsellers. She's also the author of the short story collection Homesick for Another World and a novella called Maglue. Her latest novel is Lapvona. She lives in Southern California. And Ottessa, I think I got the title correct. I was just telling Ottessa before that I often mispronounce it in conversation. So anyway, we move on to Marlon James. He's the author of the New York Times bestselling National Book Award finalist Black Leopard, Red Wolf, the Booker Prize winning A Brief History of Seven Killings, and the Book of Night Women and John Crow's Devil. In addition to the Booker Prize, his novels have won the American Book Award, the LA Times Ray Bradbury Prize for Science Fiction, the Anisfield Wolf Book Award, and the Dayton Literary Peace Prize. That is a mouthful. That means he's won a lot of prizes. Born in Jamaica, James lives in New York City. Moon Witch, Spider King is his most recent novel and the second book in the Dark Star trilogy, which is, of the moment, wonderful. Sheila Heti is the author of 10 books, including the novel How Should a Person Be?, Motherhood, and most recently, Pure Color. She also recently published the children's book A Garden of Creatures with Esme Shapiro. She was named one of the new vanguard by the New York Times, a list of 15 writers from around the world who are, quote, shaping the way we read and write fiction in the 21st century, which I think could be said of all the writers on this group. Her books have been translated into 24 languages. And I'm just pleased to welcome you to the 2022 Brooklyn Books Festival's virtual festival day for a conversation with these three amazing writers. And before we begin, I want to let you know that books by authors in this program can be purchased in the link below. Okay, so let's get down to it. This panel is called The New Fantastical. And I'd just love to know what each of you thinks of when you hear that term. And Marlon, why don't you go first?
Well, God, I hope it means no longer the old fantastical, which I am a fan of, and it's still very popular. But a lot of it tends to be basically a sort of a European view of the Middle Ages with witches, which is not a dismissive term. It sounds that way. But I was reading this really sad article in the New York Times today about the rise of the Italian far right and how they're rising on the wings of hobbits, and which would have horrified Tolkien, because this has happened before and he addressed it when he was alive. But I do think that in some ways this new fantasy it's new. It's also old. It's also, I know for me, a response to a lot of erasure. But I also think, the idea of somehow this letting go of the fantastical is a sign of even literary maturity is something that, I mean, honestly, is it's stuff like, white men came up with. It's just this idea that you when you leave behind make-believe, you leave behind a sort of maturity thing, which I think has always been ridiculous. I read novels with very, very mediocre looking white men who still have a wife and a mistress. And I'm like, and that's not make-believe? so
Good point.
So yeah, I do think that in some ways this sort of new fantastical is also a return, at least for me, to a time when mythological answers made more sense.
Mm-hmm. And that leads us to Sheila. You know, the mythological piece of your latest book is something, you know, I can really think about it wrapped around the concept of the new fantastical. Can you describe what you think of as the new fantastical, and also give us a little bit of a sense of the creation myth that is so much a part of your novel, Pure Color?
Well, I don't think I'd heard of this phrase until the panel was called The New Fantastical. So I don't know if there's some reference greater than that. But for myself, I just think, you know, to me, the imagination isn't different if you're writing something like what we're writing, or if you're writing some more so-called straight realism. It's just, in my case, what I experienced during the time that I was writing the novel made me have to be more metaphorical. It made me have to use images that I probably wouldn't have used in my previous novels, just because what I felt and what I experienced was more spiritual. Like when my father died
in 2019, right?
2018.
2018.
I felt a new sort of relationship to the world of spirit, and like a new understanding of what death might mean and not mean. And so I don't feel like I was writing in a new way. Like, it doesn't seem any different to write like she goes into a leaf versus she goes into a room. But you know, in order to capture those new feelings that I'd never had before, maybe something unfamiliar had to come onto the page. But it seemed to me still like trying to represent something that felt concrete. It wasn't trying to represent something less concrete. It was trying to represent as concrete an experience I'd had during the time of writing that book. It was just, yeah. So I don't really know what fantastical means. I think it just means that your experience going through the world is a little bit more unstable, and what you're trying to, and so you need sort of slightly more unstable or destabilizing images to represent it.
Interesting. Ottessa, is that something that you relate to? Because, you know, when I read you, I mean, I think that there is just such a wild imagination, you know, that I can't even imagine having myself. And I think most people can't either, and are drawn to your work because it enables us to, you know, to kind of follow that process, that creative process that many of us can't even imagine having. So when you think of the new fantastical, how do you think of your work as fitting in?
Thanks, Leigh. Like Sheila, I hadn't heard this term and haven't really investigated it until the theme for this panel was announced. I get my relationship to the fantastic and the fantastical is really about my connection to the imagination that I sort of suffered from and enjoyed by turns when I was little, when I was being fed materials and hadn't yet been completely brainwashed by a paradigm for how to understand them. So engaging in things like fairy tales and folklore and yes, like the medieval European village, which I wrote an entire novel about, by the way, is for me a place where I feel like I'm processing through the both a kind of like the spoils of what I've been taught is fantastic with a mind that hasn't been completely ruined by it. And I like the idea of re-envisioning a lot. And I also like the idea of just doing, following your instincts and questioning them. And so, I don't know, I think following instincts is pretty fantastical in general, but yeah, I appreciate what you said about the creative process. My creative process is my religion, and like all religions, it's about faith, and faith is, or I don't know, maybe there are religions that aren't about faith, but for me, faith is really about knowing and trusting something that that you cannot necessarily see or hold, put your finger on. And that's sort of where the imagination comes in for me.
I guess folklore and fairy tale are preeminent influences on all of you, I would say. Isn't that right? I mean, Marlon, do you want to talk about how, mythology, folklore, fairy tales have influenced you over the course of your career?
Well, yeah, I mean, I just because it's a huge part of childhood, but it's also the original stories, and a lot of these stories, mythology was fact once. That's how we live in the world. I remember somebody, Margaret Atwood on a panel saying human nature hasn't changed in 1,000 years, and by checking the mythologies. And the fact that we're still making them, we're still spinning them, we're still creating them. Sometimes not always for good. Because I think that's how we understand each other. We spin stories, and when we have extraordinary events, we look for extraordinary things to explain them. Which is that we keep where we have these stories. But folklore also for me was the only connection I had to country of origin, to place of origin. It's the only connection I had to Africa. So only connection I had to ancestors, and only consciousness I had of them, until I went and started to do research and reading up mythologies and origin narratives, and answered stories that my grandfather would have told me, or I'd have heard on the playground, was the only connection. And then I think that's it, that there is something about those original stories that we keep running back to, and we keep sort of using as a kind of grounding. It's like, if you make rock and roll, eventually you're gonna have to reckon with the blues. And I think if you're gonna be a storyteller, you do eventually have to reckon with these sort of original stories. And certainly for me, I don't necessarily think I was looking for myself in these stories, but I did find a version that could work, especially when I'm dealing with, for example, queerness. And I'm dealing with African storytelling and the reality of a lot of countries, and the huge homophobia and the whole idea that queerness is some Western thing. And then you read these stories and you come across people with 15 genders. And, people.
So interesting.
And people who don't give a damn who comes bumping in the night. And I'm realizing that folklore gave me a validation of myself that I didn't know I was looking for. And I don't think I'm the only one that happens to.
Well, Sheila, I would love to know what the origin, what came to you, how it came to you to think of the bird, fish, bear trinity. How did that emerge in your mind?
I had this when I was writing How Should a Person Be in around 2006. I had this sentence that kind of came into my head, which was, God is 3 art critics in the sky. And I kept it in my head over the years and would sort of return to it and start thinking, well, what does that mean? If there are 3, why are there 3? How are they different from each other, or are they all looking at things in the same way? Sometimes you have like a sentence that's a puzzle, or a title that's a puzzle, and you want to figure it out. so I guess after I finished writing Motherhood, I thought maybe now's the time to think about that sentence, God has three are critics in the sky, because I couldn't forget it. And, I just made a lot of, it just took I just made a lot of notes and thought a lot and thought, well, how could you make what would the three different main perspectives be on this life that we're all in?
So for readers who haven't read the book yet, just explain a little bit what those three are.
So the idea of the book is that we're living in the first draft of God's creation, and God steps back from the canvas like a painter and looks at it and sees the flaws, and God's going to start over with another draft, and that humans are here as God's critics. God listens to our critiques and complaints, and the world isn't supposed to be good for us because we are in an imperfect world, and we are supposed to be critics. And the reason that I was thinking that we're critics is because I'm always perplexed by why one can't enjoy the fact of creation more. Like, we're always getting bogged down in these critiques and always getting bogged down in problems. And there's like so much beauty, and there's just the wonder, like the craziness of being alive. You can't really rest in that for more than a few moments. You're immediately brought back to the material plane. Anyways, so in the book, what I came up with was birds, bears, and fish. Fish sort of look at the world structurally, sort of, politically, I guess I would say. They look at relations among humans sort of at large.
They seem like the most compassionate. They seem like the most compassionate
fish?
Fish, in a way, right? Or not?
In what sense?
Well, they're more concerned with each other, with the community, with social network, or at least that's what I drew from the novel.
Yeah, I don't know if that's more compassionate or not. Like the bears, like care about the ones that are close to them. Yep. They don't have like a structural critique, and the birds are basically the artists. They look at things aesthetically. I would have thought that the bears were the most compassionate. The fish, to me, are a little bit more analytical. They're not really concerned with individual people in the same way as the bears are. They're concerned with social justice. Maybe that's more compassionate. I don't know. I never thought about one as being more compassionate than the others.
I don't, it gives you the novel gives you so much to chew on, just so much to think about and, spin off of. I love thinking about the world that way as a first draft, God's first draft, and it's just brilliantly done. And Ottessa, I'm just, as I said before, I'm just in awe of your incredible imagination. What was the starting point for this latest novel? I mean, the medieval village in Europe, and you've always been fascinated to a degree with the grotesque. In this case, you're taking up a society that's kind of very twisted post-plague or in the aftermath of a plague. Tell us what the origin of that was.
It was sort of a storm of maybe 4 elements. So this might be boring, but the first element,
I doubt it,
was this premise of it's sort of like what it means to seek personal justice. And in Lapvona, a boy, it's essentially like one boy kills another boy, sort of accidentally on purpose in this weird gray area. Yeah. And that dead boy's father, who's extremely delusional, but also very powerful and believes in his self-directed intelligence, which is really strange, decides that the best way to handle this is to take this other boy in as a replacement son. And I had been chewing on that. Forget the dad. I've just been chewing on that for a couple of years, and probably had something to do with losing my little brother and thinking about sort of, you know, my brother passed away on who was then my fiance, is now my husband's birthday. And I think there's something I've been looking to answer a question like, how do you live without, you know, someone? So that was one thing in terms of the story. In terms of the setting, which is totally fictional, what feels like maybe Eastern Europe and what feels like maybe the late Middle Ages, honestly, part of it was that moving into this house. I moved into this house right before COVID, and it is literally built out of the stones from a church that was destroyed in an earthquake. And it feels, it's kind of like, it's a Spanish revival kind of Gothic weird thing that this one guy built. It's a small house in the bottom of a mountain. And I was spending a lot of time here during lockdown. And the other thing was sort of like the straw on the camel's back was, my mom has always said this to me and to my siblings when times get tough. She says, you know, she's Croatian, and she says, you know, don't forget in a way to say, like, you're stronger than this, don't be a baby. Don't forget, you come from pirates. And that, you know, I like kind of never believed her, because she's a very fantastical woman, actually. But I did a little bit of research and found some history of, you know, maritime history on the Adriatic, and that kind of sent me to the late Middle Ages. And I thought, well, you know, could I picture my ancestors? Okay, there's no way I'm writing another novel set on the ocean. I've done that. Can't. Actually, I'm stuck in another book on the ocean, and I haven't moved in 2 years. So,
Ottessa, you and I emailed a little bit after my father died. I emailed with you a little bit about that, and you were really helpful. Some of the things you said, because you'd already experienced your brother's death. But my father died on my partner, of 13 years, on his birthday.
Wow.
And it was so strange that you just said that your brother died on your, and my brain kept doing this thing, like when my father died, of just like that night, like trying to almost like collapsing time, as though my boyfriend's birth was connected to his death. Like it was just like, it took like weeks to sort of work out the math in that or something. Did you have some strange
well, there's been a lot of strange things.
That's weird.
Been a lot of strange things. I mean, I think it's a gift at this point. I think it's a gift. But I don't know. I mean, I have zero wisdom about how any of this works.
You think, what is a gift? That the
day
of the day.
Yeah, the day. At the time, I thought I was angry. Yeah. And I thought, well, this is a cruel joke my brothers played on me, destroying the rest of my lifetime with my life partner's birthday. I'll never be able to enjoy this day, I thought.
But it makes it more holy in some way, not just a birthday.
Yeah, no, it's beyond just the, you know, the egoic birthday of, oh, you're so great. You know, it is a more holy day. You're totally right.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question to anyone who is interested in answering? How does writing fiction help one process loss?
Oh, wow. It's funny because I know for me, the last novel I wrote was the first novel in a while where I actually explored grief. You know, it's a woman, she's nearly 200 years old, so she's going to see a lot of grief. And The problem with grief.
Yeah, I couldn't decide whether I was jealous of her or not for being able to live 177 years.
Yeah.
Many.
But you know, the thing about grief that I know my family never talks about is how angry it makes you. We just don't talk about it. Well, we don't really talk about anything in my family, really. But and I was very interested in that, about the anger and the rawness, and how everybody who's never experienced grief think there's a way to legislate it, and it just doesn't. It really, I think, as the thing I learned about grief, writing about, is that grief really is its own thing, and it's sort of, I mean, books are that way too. When you think you're going to come to a book and you have a process, and you realize, no, the book already dictates its own process. I mean, what you're doing is you're not bringing a process to it, you're just bringing a habit. And I think it's the same thing. And that's something that I learned writing about a character going through huge, almost a century of grief, of just loss, and how the anger part, funny enough, the funny part, which she talks about that sometime, but just how it almost becomes this, it can become this sort of person that just comes to live in your house, and you have to figure out a way to live with that person in a way.
Wow. Does anybody else have thoughts on that? On using fiction, or fiction helps process grief?
I don't know if fiction helps process grief. I don't. But I also don't think that I process anything without it going into my work. So, I wouldn't know how to live or be, I wouldn't know how to survive if I didn't have writing. Like, I'm being honest, like, I don't think I could have handled life without it, because it's been the way that I have had feelings outside of my sort of more primitive animal being. I'm not a very sophisticated person in that way, but the grief, I mean, I think, like, grief, I've never had a child, but I feel like, when you lose someone, there's this baffling amazement that I experienced, which was, I cannot believe people, and not just people, all animals, all beings, have been experiencing this since the dawn of creation. Yeah. I cannot believe it is so effing intense and powerfully beautiful and sad and everything. It is everything. And I would imagine, the giving birth is similar, becoming a parent is similar. So yeah, giving birth to, a novel, it's exactly the same. No.
Well, I'm sure this is the question you've all gotten many times, but it's so interesting to me how different artists, different people, not just artists, how differently people responded to being in lockdown, and being, during the pandemic, whereas some people were just sort of paralyzed, frozen for a while, and were unable to work creatively, and others found it to be a kind of, if they didn't get sick or, lose someone close to them, found it sort of liberating to not having to be, traveling from one place to another, to just being able to sequester. So I'm curious as to which, Sheila, for example, what was your response to the pandemic in terms of the creative output?
I don't know. I don't really like talking about the pandemic. It just doesn't seem, I don't feel like I have anything that I want to say about the pandemic.
Okay.
I'd like to hear more about Marlon's process and Ottessa's process, because it seems to me like, you know, the question that you were asking earlier about like the new Fantastical or whatever, I am curious about the imagination, because for both of you, I'd be curious to know, like, if you experience the imagination differently, like how does your experience of writing your books and what the imagination means to you in the act of writing, where is that imagination active in your everyday life? Like, or is there?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Because I don't really understand what the imagination is exactly. Like I kind of feel like, not unlike Ottessa, I don't feel a connection exactly to the childhood. And unlike you, Marlon, like I don't feel like I have stories. Maybe there's Judaism, but like I don't really feel like I have stories that I have found sort of situate me in relation to my ancestors. So I'm sort of curious to both of you, like where you feel the imagination works in real life for you, if anywhere.
I mean, the quick answer is in my humor and in my, well, I guess basically in my personality, in anything that isn't studied or canned, in anything that feels spontaneous. Which is hard to experience when I'm isolated and alone, which is answering your question, Leigh, about the pandemic. So I really need, I really need a place to put my imagination. If I'm not, interacting with anything, I need something interactive. I think of the imagination as the thing that we use to dream. And I think of it as like, I can engage in it. I can have a relationship with it and talk to it and be like, well, what if I imagined now this, or how do I answer this question? But it's also the place that gives me words. It gives me unexpected words, ways of describing things that surprise me, even though I'm the one coming up with them. To me, that's where the imagination is. It's certainly in the subconscious in a way, and my job is to learn new ways, always learning new ways to access it, and have the good judgment to see what's actually valuable and going somewhere in there.
Yeah, I would be very curious to know how hush and suck came to you.
Oh, hush and suck. Well, that's what mothers say.
Yeah.
Mother
exactly.
didn't say that?
Yeah. No, but I mean, in this context of Marek and Ina, anyway, I think that it's an ingenious pairing in the book.
Thank you.
Marlon, to Sheila's question.
Yeah, I think for me, imagination has always been the place where I get to live more than one life. Because I think I would say if you grew up in the 80s, it really doesn't matter which country you grew up in, you had the exact same 80s. You probably you were raised by TV. I mean, endless cycles of boredom. It's somewhere along the time you probably were listening to Madonna. And so even as reading one of Carlo Vinasgar's book, and he was talking about walking around in his Sonic Youth Goo t-shirt. I was like, oh, I had that t-shirt. And so it's there is a kind of, I don't know, 80s, 90s boredom where your imagination just becomes your way of living other lives. And I think that in some ways I still look at fiction that way, as just this chance to live another life. And to try to segue to your COVID question, then it became crucial because I have this when I'm teaching creative writing, I write class on boredom and how like there are different types of boredom. And if you grew up in like the suburbs, you get endlessly repeatable boredom.
Yep.
and how if God, Deborah Tall has this great essay called Here. And she talks about the street is just one house, two trees, one house, two trees, one house, two trees, all the way down. I was like, oh my God, endlessly repeatable boredom. And that imagination was a way to break that and to live somewhere that wasn't endlessly repeatable.
Yeah. Well, you know, for me growing up, reading was my escape out of boredom. But I never imagined being a writer, you know, so I think that that's obviously the distinction. You guys turned, you know, that boredom and, you know, that immersion in literature and in reading into your own visions. You know, and I think one of the reasons that the three of you has been grouped as panelists is because, I mean, Sheila, you're not really nodding to imagination, but obviously, I mean, your work is so imaginative, it's almost created its own genre, you know, so I want to say before we turn to questions in a few minutes that I'm really quite in awe of each of your abilities to, and so are so many other people, to reinvent, to reimagine, you know, to take those fairy tales of our childhoods and, you know, to, as you said, Ottessa, to not sanitize them, you know, to even kind of expound upon them, make them even more, you know, horrific in some ways. You know, I remember growing up reading, there was, you know, so many fairy tales that were, you know, that really startled me, disturbed me, scared me, and so on. And I think we've sanitized so much of that for our children now that, you know, I love the fact that each of you is, you know, just kind of recreating, reimagining, reinventing. It's the new Fantastical, I guess. So we have a couple of questions. We have a few more minutes. So let me just turn to the chat here. Question one, I'd love to hear examples of recent books that excite you and deal with fantasy, science fiction, folklore, if any come to mind. Related, have you read Harrow by Joy Williams? And if so, does that book factor into this topic as you understand it? And I don't know who this question is directed to, so anybody feel free to answer it.
Well, I haven't read Harrow yet, but I've actually, you know, I'm a big fan of both Sheila and Ottessa's work, and they directly influenced me. I also like, the thing I like about Sheila's work is the stuff I like about Bjork. You know,
that's such a good analogy.
This sort of just relentless, this sort of way of re-looking at the present tense.
Yep.
Which is what I get from Sheila's work. And I read Year of Rest and Relaxation. It was one of my pandemic books. And it was a big influence on Moonwitch, actually, because my character is, you know, 177 years old, and she has to figure out a way, how can she be absent from some of the real tragedies in her life? And quite a few of that was, I'm like, oh my God, I'm reading this book, man, maybe she slept through some of it, you know, or maybe it's, and it ties because I remember when you know, when I was growing up and dealing with some really, really just bad, you know, psychological plays, I remember I used to take cold medicine, which I wasn't sick. It's just that if I take cold medicine enough, I can do a good 16 hours where I'm not present.
Right.
So you know, to say, Ottessa's book triggered me. But it's because I mean, I read a lot when I'm writing, and I think it does come into the stuff I end up writing. So you know, to me, it was just a great coincidence you guys being on the panel because of the direct influence your work has on the stuff I write, sometimes as I'm writing it. Also stuff I'm reading now, I don't know, somebody else can answer that part.
The last novel I just finished was Wild Seed, the Octavia Butler book, which is incredible. I love this way of using the fantastic to sort of focus you in on what's most human. Like that in some ways, if you change like one thing, like that a person can live 4,000 years, then you really can see what a human is. That's, I feel like, what she does, or the effect for me of her writing. So that's a terrific book I just finished recently.
How far-seeing was she? I mean, amazing.
Oh, man.
Yeah, incredible.
I was like, you can't even call her science fiction anymore. It's
No.
no, it's got a science fact. Parable of the story.
Yeah.
You can read. A character actually says "Make America Great Again" in that book.
I know.
It's nuts.
Amazing. Yeah, she's a must-read.
Mm-hmm.
Question 2, why do you choose to use fantasy? How does it aid the process of getting your story out?
That's an interesting way of asking a question about how we make decisions. It's not as though I'm like, I need something, I'm going to choose fantasy. It's more, I related so much to the way Marlon was talking about how a book sort of moves in and is like, well, I'm going to tell you exactly what to do in order for me to get out.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, the element of fantasy, although I think I've sort of touched it in some of my short stories, but I needed a hinge to open the door wider in Lapvona, and I knew that hinge was going to be Ina, who, by the way, Marlon, is also hundreds of years old. And because of that, I mean, I can't wait to read your book and compare notes on how to do this. Because like with Ina, she comes from a major trauma, and she's been blinded by it. And she learns to live alone as a human being, completely alone in nature, and becomes fluent in bird song, and has, what becomes a supernatural ability, and also has this like very sort of arrogant perspective on human nature, because her society betrayed her in her past. And also when she returns to the society, it's because she's basically discovered or / figured out how to produce breast milk in order to feed these human babies that are needing to be fed, because there's been a blight and all the women are working in the farms, in the fields. So she is like, she's sort of like aged out of pity. Yeah. And to me, to have a character who is going to be still completely engaged in the novel and what happens, to have power on how, to have some influence on how the story moves, and to be so detached, to provide this like this little seat, this like higher ledge for the reader, from which they can look down and see things as though from the bird's eye view. I needed someone who was fantastical, who was not just human. And that one could have been a god, and there is a god in the book, but it's only ever spoken about. So, and Ina is this actual person who regains her vision through learning how to manipulate people, basically.
Yeah, there are gods present in each of your, very much present in each of your books also. That's another thread. We've come, I think, to the end of our time. And I don't know if there's something you want to leave the audience with. I've been feeling like, books continue to be banned around the country in a way that's shocking and on the rise. And therefore, I'm even more grateful than ever to the artists who are keeping us engaged and, keeping our minds alive and vibrant. So I really want to thank you for your work, as well as for joining us today at the Brooklyn Books Festival. So if there's anything you want to leave our audience with, feel free before I close us out.
Well, you were saying, Leigh, before you got on that you were in the ocean.
I am.
Are you going to go back into the ocean after this?
Yes, I am. I've been down here for 3 weeks, the first 2 working in Cape May, New Jersey. I bring various family members down, and I recently had my first grandchild. He just left a few minutes ago with my son and daughter-in-law. He saw the ocean for the first time today. And wow, the sense of wonder that each of you brings to your work is something that I, savored in real time today outside of a book. But I will be going back to the ocean with a book and go into the water until it gets to like 60 degrees. That's what I just make myself go in each time, and I feel so alive.
But which book?
Yeah, good question. I have about 5 bags of books with me. The physical galleys are still what I gravitate towards. And having read each of your books, unfortunately, it won't be one of yours, but I look forward, and I'm sure everyone does, to the next ones. And we're lucky to have you. So I guess at the end of the program, I'm thanking each of you, Ottessa, Marlon, Sheila. Everyone, please remember you can order books in the link below, and please consider making a donation to the Brooklyn Book Festival, which is celebrating its, I can't believe this, 17th year of presenting free literary programming. And a reminder that if you're in New York City next week, the in-person festival takes place on October 2nd in downtown Brooklyn. So until then, thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.